you can press
okay.
next below. Yes.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Perfect. So let's just start there. I would say to understand whether and if Mexico and liquefaction projects in Mexico make sense, have a future ahead, have a feasibility along not only the immediate term, the next 5 years, but also thinking about like 20-25 years. We're speaking of investments that are pretty hefty and that are infrastructure that takes long time to build, but also to regain its revenue. Then we're speaking that we need to really understand what's going on and whether that is feasible. So this is a few questions that I hope we can discuss along this short presentation. And I would hope that after this presentation, you have even more questions of how this will move ahead. So first of all, what is the role of natural gas in Mexico today? Is it a role for Mexico as an LNG exporter? How come that the 11th largest oil exporter in the world became suddenly the largest importer of U.S. natural gas? Why would Mexico, being a net importer of natural gas, export LNG? And basically, what is needed? What are the ifs to be met for these breaks to happen? So I think, first of all, we should look at the energy picture in Mexico in terms of this is total primary energy supply. So basically, primary consumption. And what we are looking here is a pretty stable trend in terms of overall consumption growth in Mexico, but a very interesting takeover of natural gas, phasing out and diminishing the share of other fuels, but particularly and more specifically, oil. And we're speaking about fuel oil, especially in the power sector and also in the industrial sector, and also a diminishing on coal, and a rise, especially in the last 5 years, in renewables, particularly solar and wind. And so we're going to look at this most closely. But we're speaking mainly about a story of power and the industrial sector. So let's look at natural gas demand. And natural gas demand in Mexico has shown a pretty rapid growth that started since the 2010. And then it has been increasing, and probably it stabilized a little bit in 2017, and it has been up and down ever since. However, we've seen that this growth comes mostly from one main demand sector, which is power generation. We have seen a fuel oil to gas switch in the power sector, and we looked at it. And the other one is in red, industrial demands for things like iron, steel, cement has had some growth, and this is also because there's availability of natural gas in regions where it was not available before in Mexico, and also an enhanced and increased capacity for imports. And one point that I would like to highlight too is in color green, you can see energy industry on use. Basically, we're speaking about that of domestic consumption of the state-owned company Pemex. So basically, this is natural gas that Pemex uses for its internal processes, including exploration, extraction of oil and gas, including refining, including the petrochemical industry. So what we've seen here is that Pemex is the single largest consumer of natural gas for these processes, leaving the rest really and purely 13% of net injections. So we're going to go to this later on, but from all the domestic production done by Pemex, there's only a 13% of net injections to the system. So like with this, we're saying like the story here is about the power sector. So let's zoom in a little bit on the power sector. And what we can see here is that natural gas has completely dominated this change and follow this oil to gas switch in the power sector, in the matrix that I was talking about. So we can see how in 2000, about 46% of power generation was done with oil, mostly fuel oil and diesel. And that share has diminished quite drastically to only 7% last year. While in natural gas, it is precisely the opposite, 21% only in 2000, and now it is 63% this year, last year, 2021. So we're speaking that natural gas has really taken over and today represents the single dominant source of power generation. And that has driven, an important source of demand and supplies. However, we're looking now to the demand side of the story. If we look at the supply side, we need to talk about this. And this is a massive increase on import capacity, and important to say too, and capacity within Mexico that has taken gas to regions where there is not available. So in color red, we can see what was back in the day, the national company's Pemex infrastructure of gas pipelines. Now it is an independent system operated by an independent system operator called Senagas. And then on green, we see pipelines owned by private operators, including big companies like Sempra Energy, TC Energy, Fermaca, which most of them were promoted by the state-owned utility, Comisión Federal de Electricidad, CFE. And so what CFE did basically was anchoring projects of power generation, power plants, to be the main off-taker of this infrastructure that was to be developed. And they did so in a pretty successful way over the past about 10 years. So you can see, especially on the northwest part of the region, that is connecting West Texas, the Waha hub, which, by the way, is sold normally at a discount of the Henry Hub prices. So it's like very, active, affordable natural gas volumes from the Permian Basin that were flowing directly to this part of the country, which before was only energy needs were met only with fuel oil, kind of like what Adrian was describing on the last presentation that happened in different countries, what that was the reality in this part of the country. So this has changed, and now we can see that this infrastructure allows molecules of natural gas produced in Western Texas to go all the way to the northwest, but also the center of the country, the West Coast, and even all the way to the East Coast. So that is very important. I think this is something to consider. Then this has been spoken a lot by the new administration, or by the current administration in Mexico, that CFE has an excess capacity, and that infrastructure is that would allow CFE and Mexico to supplement or to supply these additional volumes of natural gas for exporting it. And this is partly true. And why is it partly true? Because there has been different problems on the development of this strategy. One of them was that there were some pipelines to which the power plant that what they were meant to meet was not there yet. So it's a pipeline going to a plant that is not there. And in other cases, there was the opposite problem. There was a power plant ready to be operated, but there was no pipeline ready built, because some of these projects were facing different, different obstacles. Some of them social communities opposition, others delays on the construction process, permitting, and so on. And that is the case still today. So what we do have is that in some cases, some of these pipelines have been used to a fraction of their actual capacity. And I think this is important, something to consider. Then let's look at the supply side of things. And on the supply side, we see that domestic production really peaked in 2010, and it has declined 60% ever since, doing so repeatedly every year. So today, we have that 70% of supply comes actually from a single source, which is natural gas coming from Texas. And this has taken over not only domestic production, but also LNG imports. LNG imports used to be, up to 3 years ago, about 10% of total supply in Mexico. That's not anymore the case. They have pretty much vanished, and they represented less than 5% last year. This year, they're in a historical low. And so what we see is a reliance, an increased dependence on reliance on this single source, which is natural gas from Texas. And this is the gas, and this is the supply that is meant to feed these projects, right? So as I said, there has been a wave of about 10 projects, in reality 7. I differentiated it in different phases. But basically, the idea of these projects is to use this existing or newly developed capacity to re-export this gas, particularly in the Pacific coast. But most recently, we've seen 2 of them on the other coast, on the Atlantic coast. So I will briefly try to talk a little bit on those. We got ICA LNG that is being developed by Sempra, Californian company. And this is important to say. Of these 45 million tons per annum projects that are in 10 projects, and that would take Mexico to be the fourth largest LNG exporter. Well, that's what would happen if all of these are developed. But today we only have Ica LNG being developed, and just the phase one, by the way. So this is meant to be operational by late 2024, perhaps 2025. But this is the only one that is reality right now. There's a phase two that is proposed, and we can see the other projects being proposed in green. We got Mexico Pacific Limited, LNG in Puerto Libertad, Sonora, and that would connect with a new pipeline coming from Arizona using Texan natural gas. And then there's another one, Amigo LNG, that we'll hear later on. I'll be very keen to see what they have to share with us. But basically, one thing to consider here is that both of these projects will be using the same pipeline that is owned, by the way, by Sempra Energy. So there would be some competition, not only for this gas and other sources to go, but just between these two projects. There's another project developed by Sempra, which is Vista Pacifico LNG, that one is meant to be built in Topolobampo. That has another problem, that is that there are two pipelines that got there, the El Encino Topolobampo, which is that red one coming straight to it, but also one in gray, that one is a pipeline that has like severe problems on their construction process. It's being renegotiated and rerouted. And so the feasibility of this project is really contingent to the redevelopment of these other pipelines, right? So definitely a tough way along the hill. And then we got Salina Cruz LNG that was announced by the Mexican president, AMLO, and is meant to be developed by CFE Energy. This has not only a problem in terms of additional infrastructure to be developed. There's a gas pipeline that needs to cross from the Gulf Coast up to this Pacific port, but also it is meant to secure, it has like higher rates for transportation. It's just farther from the source of production. So the cost would be also very high, and it would probably not make it competitive. And when we got two interesting projects, both of them developed or to be developed by New Fortress Energy. One is a joint partnership with Pemex, which is the Lakach floating liquefied natural gas facility that is basically an offshore feeding liquefaction plant. That is interesting. Lakach is what was an abandoned field that is to be redeveloped according to these plans. And so it's a high risk, it's a project, but perhaps this one could work. And then something similar, but with CFE, is happening in Altamira FLNG, in which the NFE is aiming to take advantage of the offshore pipeline existing that was commissioned in 2019, and that with some spare capacity, and that spare capacity is coming from other pipelines in problems and natural gas power plants that are under construction or planned to be developed. So today, that there is that spare capacity that perhaps would allow Altamira FLNG to take some of that gas and export it. But then the problem is when we looked at that in a longer term, right? So there's a small summary of these projects that we go. As I said, there are in essence 7, but they are 10 if we separate them by phase, right? For most of them, there's not a lot of information that we have. We don't have concrete figures on investment. We don't really have estimated dates of commissioning. And the reason for that is because some of them, as you can see on status, are contingent to the development of additional infrastructure, right? Which that would make them pretty hard to happen. Then there are two other considerations that need to be taken here. One is that U.S. natural gas exports have been abundant and unaffordable historically and until today. But will this be the case in the future? Will this the case in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years? That's very hard. And that is because the share of gas exports of U.S. gas production, being mostly pipeline exports to Canada and Mexico, and LNG exports has risen. And it is today 20% of all of natural gas production in the United States. That has, that is a trend that we expect to increase and to further affect not only the volumes, but also the prices. And we've seen that. And so I want to attract your attention to these two developments. One is this first one that I was speaking. So is natural gas from from the US, is the Henry Hub benchmark continue to be as unaffordable as it has been in these 10 years? Probably not. Probably we're now, as we have seen in the last year, in the last 14 months perhaps, the end of the sub $5 Henry Hub era. We've seen it. It was close to around 8 for most of this year. It was close to $10. And really, the main reason that it went down was because of the Freeport LNG outage. So we see an internationalization of the Henry Hub. And perhaps this would mean that there will be increased competitivity between, there will be more competition between volumes for LNG exports and volumes to be imported to Mexico. And so this would be really an price bidding that would probably give an upward pressure. And then on the other hand, we see by two different scenarios, but the US Energy Information Administration, they don't expect for the longer term, 2050, a substantial rise or increase on pipeline exports to Mexico. And this poses a problem because that means that Mexican consumers, Mexican demand will be in competition with not only LNG exports in the US, but potentially also with these LNG projects exports. And then an additional idea, which really I just want to highlight, is like on the longer term, there's an unprecedented uncertainty on what is the role of natural gas in the energy transition, especially when thinking about a net zero scenario, if the world is to be serious about a 2 degrees or 1.5 degree scenario. So according to the IEA report launched last year, the role of natural gas has to look something like this in purple, right? There would be a peaking in the next decade, and then there would need to be a decrease on the global demand of it. This, of course, will look very different in different regions and in different countries. But how would this look in Mexico? How would this look in the developed world, which would be the main importers in principle in the short term, at least, of these LNG volumes? And how would that look in the developing world? Very different. So this is something definitely to be considered, and especially because, as we said, these assets they are very capital intensive, take a lot of time to be built, and these could be legacy infrastructure, maybe in 20 years, in 30 years, we don't know if that be used. So there's a risk of stranded or transitional assets, right? Like we don't know how long would that be developed. And that poses a problems for developers, of course, and in other considerations. So just to wrap up, and I'll be more than happy to have to continue the conversation, is natural gas is an increasingly dominant in Mexico's energy sector. Demand growth is a story of power generation, along with other sectors, industry to a lesser extent. But with an increasing supply gap, Mexico is dependent of about 70% of its total gas supply from a single source, which is Texas. And this has created important challenges, including energy security. In February 2021, with the energy vortex that affected Texas, Mexico was in a very dire situation. There were blackouts in Northeast Mexico. The prices skyrocketed, so there's a problem. There's an issue on affordability. If Henry Hub is meant to be raised, that would pose severe problems for 70% of electricity generation in Mexico. And there's a problem too of methane emissions, right? Like that's an issue of greenhouse gases that needs to be abated, that there's increased pressure from the financial sector, ESG, and it means addition in capital for that. And then I would say the LNG projects in Mexico are based on the need of abundant and affordable US produced in Mexico and present in Mexican coast. So this means that LNG exports are projected to rise at least 20%. But at the same time, US gas production is not expected to increase at a lower rate, at the same rate. So Mexican pipe imports being at the same level would necessarily compete with each other. So this is a tough point if we think on the next 10 years, right? So I would say of the 10 projects, most of them would compete not only with US LNG projects, also with Mexican demand, and also between them. So I would say it's extremely unlikely to see the development of all of these projects, but perhaps some of them may materialize with a shiny outlook in the shorter term, but a rather cloudy one on thinking 2040, 2050. I think that something similar to what happened in Canada, perhaps, where there were a myriad of projects on the West Coast and the East Coast, and then only actually one big happen, right? LNG Canada, perhaps something like that happen, or something like in the US where there are a bunch of projects being proposed and actually, just some of them actually materialize, right? So these are my thoughts on the future of LNG projects in Mexico. I'll be more than happy to receive your questions, and if you have any more, please send them through, and I'll be happy to continue the conversation. Thank you very much, Kenna, for the invitation, and thank you for making this happen and this conversation on interchange of ideas.
Thank you, Diego. Yes, we have a few questions here that I would like to make to you, and the first one that you really partially mentioned is, apart of those that you mentioned, what other challenge do you see for the developments of these liquefaction facility projects in Mexico?
Right. So first of all, we have to consider just financing, right? Just without like touching the technical part, just financing in developing countries presents different challenges. The macroeconomic stability has been mostly okay recently, but that's a big problem. Just like the investments, the getting the money, securing those investments in the long term, that's one factor. A second commercial really problem that I see is just having the certainty of securing those contracts. This is something that Alex was talking about. Just having that certainty that in 10 years or 15 years, there will be customers willing to buy those volumes and secure those ones, right? Perhaps in 5 years, there'll be like plenty of, say, European consumers that will be happy to import those volumes, but not necessarily, in the future, right? And then I would say just like on the technical part, there's not enough capacity right now to build all of them, right? Not capacity of transportation, of import, and perhaps of production. So really it's an issue, and I think perhaps that's the most important, in which there's uncertainty on whether there be sufficient abundance of volumes and whether it's going to be affordable, actually. So I think for the projects to happen, there would need to be abundant gas, there would be to be affordable, and there would be lower in carbon to see in the future. And I don't see clarity on whether most of these projects will have that.
Thank you. Another question: what type of U.S. Are LNG projects in Mexico linked to Henry Hub of Waha?
Right. This is a great question, and really it depends on the project, right? So, for instance, in principle, I would think that the ones on the Northwest Coast, so that'd be Amigo LNG, that'd be MPL, and ICA, might be linked to Waha, right? Like that gas is coming from them, whereas the others would be coming from Henry Hub. But we don't know. And at the end of the day, what we've seen in the more like medium-term trend is that those spots that were very different have trend to converge. So like the difference between them might be smaller in the future. However, we did see last month, there was still almost like a deja vu of what we've seen like on the last 2 or 3 years, where there was an important gap between Waha and Henry Hub, and we used to have negative prices there. I don't think that's going to be the case in the future, but some of them would be Waha and others would be Henry Hub. Plus, let's mention this, a transportation fee of however and whatever they are located and built, right? Which in some cases might not be minor. That would be the case of Salina Cruz. And for New Fortress Energy, that'd be different, especially for the Lacache one.
Thank you. Perhaps we can take the last one. And it's in the current energy crisis, Diego, do you think that the development of these projects will contribute to line it up? Alex already mentioned earlier at this point.
Will contribute to what? Sorry, didn't get.
To boost these projects in Mexico.
That's a tough one. No, I'm not sure, really. I think that's an uncertain one. I'm not clear that they would be for sure. At least in the short term, there is definitely a push, as I said, for the 5-10 years. But in the future, if they are not secure long-term agreements, and that could be an opportunity. That I would like to mention this for the developing world, like importers like India, especially in Southeast Asia, India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan. That could be an opportunity for a longer term securing those deals. but I don't see necessarily that would mean like an enough push for that kind of.
Well, thank you, Diego. Gracias for joining us today. It's an excellent presentation.